Back to our top story now. A quick reminder, the UK High Court has granted whistleblower Julian Assange the right to appeal his extradition. Let's discuss this now with our guest. We're crossing live to the leader of the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist, Ranjit Brar, for his reaction on the ruling. Many thanks for joining us on the programme, Ranjit. So just tell us how significant this ruling is in favour of Julian Assange's right to appeal his extradition. And what's your immediate reaction to the news?
Thanks, Nikki. I'm obviously very happy about the outcome of this stage in his hearing, but we must never forget that it is just a stage and does not yet signify a victory for Assange. We are out here, just here in front of the Royal Courts of Justice, and you can see there's a carnival atmosphere behind me. Many people have turned up, hundreds, perhaps 500 of Julian Assange's supporters who followed him throughout this process. But what we really feel is that it's not Julian who is on trial here today. We feel it's the British judicial system which is on trial. And above all, the much vaunted freedom of speech and freedom of the press, which Anglo-American imperialism, what they call themselves, the democratic free world, but we increasingly see to be an isolated and aggressive group of very wealthy finance capitalists who really stand behind the politics and policy of our country, constantly claim that they have a moral superiority based upon the right of the individual to speak up, the right of the free press. Just recently, we celebrated once again so-called World Free Press Day. I think every year when World Free Press Day is celebrated and trumpeted, we must look at anyone who makes mention of it and say, if they don't mention Julian Assange, if they don't point out the obvious hypocrisy that you're allowed to deliver any message so long as it's in tune with the interests, the financial interests of Anglo-American imperialism, but if you speak against them, you're rapidly moved to be shut down, including criminal proceedings. And of course, Julian Assange, there's been a lot of concern highlighted from the UN rapporteur for torture, that the conditions Julian is still being held under in Belmarsh, even as he wins this verdict, are torture. And this is the reality versus the apparent free speech that we enjoy in the West.
Absolutely. I mean, like you say, it's a positive note today, but still the fight goes on for Julian Assange. This long saga continues. How might this decision impact this broader discussion that you mentioned on press freedom and whistleblowers' rights worldwide?
Well, I think, outside of Britain, outside of the United States, outside of the European Union, it will have a big impact. There's huge support for Julian Assange. We've seen the attempt to win a measure of freedom of speech. We've seen organizations like your own, like Press TV, like Russia Today, who, many millions of people in our country followed for an objective look at the news and for really another perspective, an open dialogue on information. We've seen them be closed down when they contradicted and exposed key lies upon which our ruling class rests. So that is an ongoing debate. It is undoubtedly a victory that Julian Assange won't face extradition this moment. But of course, all he's really won is a right to a further appeal, and an appeal to the very power who have been keeping him for the last 10 years under house arrest, first of all in the Ecuadorian embassy, and then, of course, in Belmarsh prison for 3 years. And when no crime at all has been adduced upon which he is supposed to have transgressed. Initially, don't forget, the whole question revolved around an alleged abuse of 2 women in Scandinavia, in Sweden. That was totally withdrawn. We know our own future Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, as leader of the prosecution service, was heavily implicated in extending and bringing those charges to bear, despite the fact that essentially they had collapsed. And then, it was clear from that moment that what Assange was really on trial for was his exposure of US war crimes, particularly in Iraq. A very, powerful footage. Maybe you could share it with your viewers of an American US gun
many times.
Helicopter gunship shooting down civilians, members of the press in Iraq without any justification whatsoever. Is this kind of information that, of course, we're not shown in our embedded, sanitized journalism, which is why we have a very distorted picture in our country of most global events. The one that's going on at the moment, of course, is the conflict in the Middle East and Palestine, and you've got very extensive coverage of the tragic death of Ibrahim Raisi. We don't yet know why that helicopter went down. But of course, the entire conflict is shown to us in a distorted light, as if it's, the victims themselves are to blame. And of course, the other major conflict that's happening at the moment is the special military operation in Ukraine, where we are not shown that Anglo-American imperialism essentially deprived Kiev and Ukraine of all sovereignty as far back as 2014 and have been relentlessly pushing to war. So this question of Julian Assange has to be linked with the broader question of political freedom, of political propaganda, and that essentially what we have in our country is a prolonged and ongoing information war. It is a full spectrum information war waged against the people of our country in particular, but of the Western world in general. And that's why that narrative is so key to their not just past crimes, but their ongoing crimes that they're currently perpetrating. And this is why, but while I'm happy that Assange has won the right to appeal, let's not forget that all he's won is the right to a further appeal. He's essentially still within a system in which the cards are stacked against him, and which, despite all rule of law and all written law, it's the people, the ruling class of our country, are making the decisions, and he still remains very much at their mercy.
And what will the next steps be in Assange's legal battle? Will we ever see him as a free man?
It's really questionable. He's being held under conditions which the UN Special Rapporteur for torture has described as torture. We must never forget that he's been too unwell to join us in court today, precisely because of the conditions in which he's been held, not just for three years in Belmarsh, in a high security terrorist facility, where his crime is journalism, but he's being held like a terrorist. He's being held very often in solitary confinement. He's being denied access to lawyers and kept in conditions which are cramped and inhuman, which do amount to torture. Prior to that, of course, he's been essentially locked in the Venezuelan embassy for now another 7 years, meaning that he's been essentially confined for a decade for his crime of journalism. So we are struggling with an existential question of his health and how quickly he can bring his case to appeal. And then, of course, it will depend once again on who is assigned to adjudicate over those decisions. Back in the days of the north of Ireland, the overt occupation, we had an inquiry called the Widgery Tribunal into the Bloody Sunday massacre perpetrated by the British Army, 2 Para Brigade in the north of Ireland. And the Republican community rather wrote on the walls, "Widgery washes whiter." Britain has a long history of holding inquiries into its own crimes, exonerating itself. And so, the form of justice hides quite a direct and purposeful rule, which will be the express interest of the ruling class. And I'm afraid that the next Labour administration holds no great hope for us. It's really a question of the pressure that the people on the street and Britain can maintain. And in that context, we really need to see a wider involvement of the journalistic fraternity in Britain, the journalistic community and profession, of the unions, of the workers. If we are able to get the British people very much involved and informed, we have some hope. But it's from this source, really, that the only realistic source of pressure can be brought to bear on his captors.
Thank you so much for speaking to us today. I really appreciate your time. We've been talking to Ranjit Brar, leader of the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist. Thank you very much.